Alrighty, today's lesson is going to be a collection of the many different modes and settings you have in your camera. However, many of these ideas aren't super related, I guess, so they're going to be like kind of sectioned out by themselves, and I'll do my best to sequence them in a way that makes the most amount of sense. On your camera, you'll have a bunch of different shooting modes. And typically, most cameras will have a full auto mode, a program auto mode, which will be shown as P, an aperture priority mode, which will be shown as A or AV, a shutter priority mode, which will be shown as S or TV, and a full manual mode, which will be shown as an M. Now, all of these different shooting modes are based on the different pillars of the exposure triangle, and they all help with the workflow that you might have or might want to use when it comes to how you shoot. At one end of the spectrum, we have full auto, which is fully automatic, and the camera decides, absolutely everything for you. You just need to press the shutter button. And then in the middle, we kind of have what's called semi-automatic modes. So P, which is essentially ISO priority, and then aperture priority and shutter priority are all semi-automatic modes. And then the last one we have is M, which is full manual mode. Now, in the next section, we'll go through each one of these modes and, why you would want to use it, what I recommend that you start with, and what I personally use on an everyday, day-to-day basis. But let's start with full auto. Most of the time, it'll be a setting with the auto label and usually a green highlight on it. I don't know why, but it's always for some reason green. Now, there's nothing wrong with using this mode, and it can be occasionally good in a pinch. But if we are trying to learn photography properly, then we need to have more control over our camera so that we can change the settings according to the creative vision that we have, rather than having the camera try and guess things for us. So from now on, consider this mode off limits. You are not allowed to use auto mode for the sake of practice. Going down the line, program mode really isn't all that much better either. In program mode, your shutter speed and aperture controls are both locked, and the camera does the adjusting for you. You do, however, have access to changing your ISO values, which is more than what you get with full auto, which I guess that's a good thing, I guess. But this kind of mode is only really good for when you have like a scene where things aren't moving very much and you feel really lazy, like if you're shooting a landscape or something like that. But otherwise, there's not really that much use for it. And again, this is one of those modes that's going to be off limit for us for this course and for the sake of practice. But aperture priority is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. In aperture priority mode, your shutter speed and ISO are locked, but you still have control over the aperture. And that means you have control over things like depth of field, which is really nice because then your shutter speeds and your ISO will change to that. And this is especially useful if you say, for example, are switching between two subjects that require different levels of depth of field really, really quickly. Like, let's say, for example, you were out shooting landscapes, but you also wanted to quickly get some detail shots of some wildlife that was near some trees or something. You could change to f8 for your landscapes and then to f1.4 to then get some nice bokeh on that animal, and then the camera would try and figure out the rest. Shutter priority is the other semi-auto mode that is occasionally worth using. And this one, as you've probably guessed, gives you full control over your shutter speed and it locks you out from aperture and ISO. As I mentioned before in the exposure triangle lessons, shutter speed is the most important thing when considering your overall image, and having this control in this semi-auto mode allows us to focus on that and lets the camera figure out the rest. And this is especially useful if you find yourself going from moving subjects to still subjects quickly, like in street photography where you'd want to shoot images of people, but also potentially document buildings and environments that don't move as well. Fast shutter speeds for people, slower ones for things that don't move. It's also useful for shooting moving subjects that are varying in size and distance as well. You can have slower shutter speeds for smaller subjects and, quickly change faster shutter speeds for large subjects. And then we have M, or full manual mode. Now, full manual mode is, as you guessed it, a fully unlocked manual mode for the camera. And honestly, it's the mode that I recommend that you start in. The aim of the game when it comes to the technique and the craft of photography is to master all of the technical skills as fast as you can so that they all become second nature as fast as possible. And for you to reach the point where you no longer need to think about the settings because you're just that fast, you need a setting that allows you to do that. And that is full manual. If you use a semi-automatic mode, you'll hinder how fast you can learn because, as we know, the three pillars of the exposure triangle all work with each other. And if the objective is to learn as quickly as possible, then we really need to be able to cover all three. Now, of course, you'll find that full manual mode has a very, very high learning curve, and you'll find that when you first start out, you will be extremely slow. And that's how it's supposed to be. It requires practice, but don't get discouraged. It is this act of moving through the discomfort that will cause you to grow. So embrace it and embrace the journey. I'd only suggest that you move on to auto or semi-automatic modes, later on, much later on down the line, when you have a very, very firm understanding and very great technical proficiency of how to use full manual so that you can then streamline your workflow because you know what you're doing, right? But otherwise, I would recommend to stick to full manual. Even for me now, as a professional, I still use full manual. However, I also use it with auto ISO in a range so that I can have full control over my aperture and my shutter speed, but I let my camera decide how best to adjust the ISO within a certain range. And I personally find that this mode works for me the best and allows me to be the fastest while retaining the most amount of creative control. Okay, before we go too deep into the rest of these settings, let's talk quickly about light metering. So light metering is your camera's way of measuring what the current amount of light is, and therefore it's able to recommend or adjust the correct amount of exposure in your particular scene. And we already kind of went through this when we were talking about underexposing and overexposing. Now, in the old days, you used to have a separate light meter for measuring the amount of light in a given scene before you took the shot so that you knew what to expose your camera at, and hopefully you would get that exposure right with the correct information. But in the modern era, light meters are built into every single camera right onto the sensor, which is super convenient. When the camera meters or measures the scene for light, there are three main modes or ways that most cameras tend to have. The first one is multimetering, also known as matrix on Nikon or evaluative on Canon. This is probably the most common way to meter for light. And how this works is that the sensor will divide the entire scene into sections and then measure each section individually. It will then take the average of all of those sections across the entire sensor to give an average that the camera will then balance out towards. And most of the time, for most genres of photography, you'll be using this setting. Now, the second one is center weighted, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The camera will take the center section of a scene and it will measure the amount of light there and give you a recommended exposure balance related to that. And this is great when you know that your subjects are going to be specifically in the very middle of the frame. And the third is spot metering. So this is for when you want absolute precision in your exposure. You want to select a specific spot in the scene and the sensor will measure how much exposure is in that specific spot for you. And this method, while very accurate, is very slow, as you can imagine, because if your subjects change positions, you have to re-meter in that new spot. It is, however, very good for things like shooting into the sun, where you might want to meter for something that you're shooting backlit or what have you. Now, to start with, I would just recommend sticking to multi, as it is the easiest and provides the most consistent results every single time. And it's very rare that you'll be metering in any other modes just in general. So learn multi first, and you can expand on the others later on. Now, on most cameras, you'll notice that on the bottom there will be a little bar that has a minus and a plus on it and little dots. This is your light meter, and every camera will have some version of this, so try and find it if you can, but we've already covered this in the past as well. Now, when you have any portion of your controls on auto, be it whether in aperture priority or shutter priority, or you're in manual mode but have auto ISO on, you'll have access to what's called exposure compensation. Now, what you can do with this is you'll be able to tell the camera that you would like to expose the image for higher or lower than what the camera is suggesting for that perfect exposure. And this is a great way to be able to use some kind of automatic shooting mode, but being also able to control the light and settings in some way as well. So for example, if you're shooting street photography and you're using aperture priority mode, you can select an EV of -1, an exposure value of -1, and the camera will then try and figure out where to remove that one stop of light from in the settings for you. And obviously, if you're in aperture priority, it won't take it from aperture, so it'll try to balance the light from either shutter speed or ISO. Very handy. Now, further to this idea, while most of the time you would want to aim for a 0 exposure on the light meter, as in a perfect exposure, sometimes you may find yourself in situations where you want to go under this number or over this number for creative reasons. And again, this is called overexposing when you go above any value from 0, and underexposing when you go below any value from 0. Now, there are many situations where you would want to go either over or under when it comes to exposing your image, and I won't go into all of them because creativity is totally up to you, but some great examples might include underexposing to make your image really dark and moody with lots of shadows and lots of harsh light and hard contrast, or you might want to overexpose in a portrait to make your image look washed out and more dreamy. If you have a low to mid-range camera that doesn't have a lot of dynamic range as well, then you might want to just slightly underexpose your images so that your highlights don't get too bright and what we call blown out. Blown out areas means that there is no more detail in those highlight parts because you've either gone too far towards being too bright or even too dark even. Sometimes with older sensors, their dynamic range just isn't as good in general, which specifically means that they're unable to capture certain spectrums of detail, right? And when you edit your photos later, you're able to go back and bring some of this detail back if you shoot in the RAW format, which we'll talk about very soon. But unfortunately, if you shoot too far over or too far under, once the information is lost, it's lost forever and it's unrecoverable, and that detail is gone effectively. So keep this in mind. It is a little bit of an advanced concept, so if you don't understand it right now, then that's totally okay. Come back to this section when you know how many stops of dynamic range your particular camera has and where it is strong and what the weak points are and how it handles all of that. Now, the histogram is one of the things that I really encourage you to learn as soon as possible. The histogram is a graph that represents a light. And you'll see this graph everywhere, in your camera, on your monitor, in the viewfinder, in every single editing program you come across, everywhere, everything to do with photography, you'll see it. And in the graph, on the left side, it refers to the amount of dark areas you have in your image, and on the right side, it refers to the amount of highlights you have in your image. The higher the peaks, the more information that image has in those regions. Now, I stress learning about and getting used to the histogram because it is the most accurate representation of the amount of light in your composition. Why this is important is that you'll be looking through the viewfinder or using your screen to preview your shot. However, every single screen has different representations of highlights and darks, and monitors have different brightness levels and different contrast ratios, and sometimes it can be really hard to see your preview even like in direct sunlight. The histogram, however, will always be accurate in terms of how much light there is in the scene, so you can always depend on it even when the situations are tough or even in just day-to-day shooting in normal conditions. Not only that, but using the histogram means that you can see whether your exposure is too bright or too dark relative to the way your camera is exposing or metering the scene, or even previewing it from the back of the camera. In your camera settings, you'll definitely come across something that has to do with image quality when it comes to the photos that you take in your camera. And most of the time, that will probably be format. And there are a myriad of formats to choose from here, such as HEIC, PNG, and JPEG. Just stick to JPEG because that's the most widely used image format in the world and will continue to be for a very long time to come. The other formats are fine, but they all have their own different purposes, different strengths and weaknesses. That's a topic that's a little bit too advanced and not really worth your time right now, in my opinion, but you can dive into those if you want. But aside from those, you'll most certainly come across a format that looks a little bit different to the others, and that is called RAW. Now, RAW images are fantastic because they contain little bits of extra information when you shoot them, allowing you to customize and edit your images in post-processing applications like Lightroom with an amazing amount of flexibility. Seriously, it's like a night and day difference editing between like a JPEG versus editing a RAW image. A RAW is better in every single conceivable way except for file size. You see, the JPEG format is what's called a compressed format. That is, it is deliberately made smaller because smaller files are easier to manage, to store, to send, and so on, especially on the internet. And because it is smaller, it means that the information on the image, things like color and exposure and such, are typically referred to what is called flattened. And that means there isn't any detail or any more data in that image aside from what you see in the image. What you see is what you get, and this is great for displaying out final images and sharing them around online. However, RAW files are typically uncompressed and contain all of the image data that the sensor has to offer so that it can provide you with all of the information so that you can then make edits to it and then compress it in whatever file format you want to later on. Think of it like the way you make food. The ability of choosing and purchasing a bunch of different ingredients to put together and then you cook them all. That process is shooting in RAW. You have flexibility. You can change things. You can edit things. You can prep things in a different way. But then, when it's all cooked and nice and perfect and you've taken the time to present it in a particular way and you give it to the person who's going to eat it, it's done. It's pretty, it looks good, and it is what it is, and the person then takes that as food as presented and then eats it, right? That's the compressing your image into a JPEG and then showing it to someone. Cooking analogies aside, of course, this raw level of information comes at a cost. And that cost is that the size of a raw image can be significantly bigger than a JPEG. Oftentimes, many multiples, actually. JPEGs can typically range anywhere from 1 to 20 megabytes each. However, some RAWs can range from 20 to 100 megabytes each, depending on the format and how many megapixels that image has. That all being said, storage nowadays is cheap, and the flexibility these RAW files provide you in post is absolutely invaluable to your post-processing process. We'll go through more about post-processing image storage towards the end of the course, but for now, just make sure that you are shooting in RAW. You won't regret it. So while photography is all about photographing light and understanding the quality of light, light also typically comes in a color, or what's known as a temperature or a tint as well. And it's these two things, temperature and tint, that determine what the true color of white is. And that color is a very important idea to understand because the color of true white is the basis to which all of the other colors are set from in an image. Now, in photography, we measure the temperature of white based off a standard color, which is what the color of light looks like at noon, the midday sun. This kind of light that you get at this time of day is what we consider to be a neutral kind of light. And then from there, this light can then be either more warm or it can look more cool. And typically, when we are looking at a sunset, for example, we get a bunch of bright, warm hues of yellows and oranges and reds. Whereas, during the blue hour, the light becomes cool and blue and purple, especially in areas of shadow. And this change of color of light is important to note because in order for a scene to look normal or neutral in color, a camera has to compensate for that. Because our eyes naturally do this, but our cameras have to be specific in how they go about this. And this is what we're going to dive into. So the way we measure color temperature is in units of Kelvin. Daylight or neutral light is around 5,200 to 6,000 Kelvin. Then the warmer temperatures can go down to 3,000 for a warm sunset, or even all the way down to 1,000 for something really warm like a candle, for example. On the cooler side of things, we can go up to 8,000 for a cloudy day outside, or even up to 12,000 for blue hour. Coming back to the scene and what we consider normal, when we're in different lighting conditions, different lights call for different kinds of compensation of white balance so that we can then adjust the color of the light to then make it look normal again. sometimes in certain cameras, you'll be able to change the Kelvin value directly. And in other cameras, they might have pre-made settings with names such as incandescent, fluorescent, indoors, and such. These are preset recommended Kelvin for those particular lighting scenarios. So play around with how they look like to you, and then you can determine for yourself if that's what you like. Now, it's important to understand how to do this for yourself manually, but also know that if you shoot RAW, which again, I really highly recommend that you should be doing, we can actually set the white balance to auto and then just let the camera figure it out. And then if it's wrong and then we want to change it, we can actually do that when we go in to edit our photos in the post-processing process. That's because the RAW format doesn't specifically contain any color information in it when you actually shoot it. It only contains color in the conversion process. So we can actually go and change the whole white balance here as much or as little as we want with no detriment to the image at all when editing our images. And this is one of the many powers of shooting in RAW. In general, I recommend shooting in auto white balance and in RAW format because white balance is usually one of those things that actually has a very little return on your time changing it all the time. Plus, modern cameras are typically pretty good and pretty fast at figuring out what the actual white balance is supposed to be. So I recommend using those settings, and I still use those settings even to this day. Now, in addition to color temperature, light, and the idea of a white balance can also have tint to it as well. Usually, rather than being warm or cool, tint is either towards the green or the magenta spectrums. And you will find that you will probably not have to adjust tint all that often, and it usually appears in situations where you have artificial lighting, such as when you're photographing indoors or under fluorescent lights or what have you. Now, the good thing here is that tint is also automatically adjustable as well. So when you set your camera white balance to auto, it will also adjust the tint for you at the same time as adjusting the temperature. Very handy. Now, it's also worth noting at this point that all camera manufacturers will have different white balances for different scenes. You could photograph the same scene with the same subject with the same lighting, but with two different cameras from two different manufacturers, and they could both turn out looking very different to one another when it comes to white balance and color generally. Now, this is due to many aspects about how camera manufacturers approach something called color science, but this is a very advanced topic to be talking about right now, and definitely not worth your time learning about at the beginning stages of your journey. But again, it's convenient that white balance is made up of both color temperature and tint, and that our cameras are typically pretty good at getting them right when it comes to auto white balance. And you know, if they mess up, then as long as we're shooting in RAW, which we should be doing, then we can just change it easily if we so wish to. Okay, today's assignment is all about getting used to our cameras. Specifically, we want to find out exactly where every single setting we talked about today is and how to change it. And then we also want to see the changes and test them for ourselves in real time. So the things that I want you to find out how to do in your specific camera are full auto mode, program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, full manual. Then find out how to quickly change into each one of these modes and spend some time in each of these modes to see how your camera locks you out of specific settings when you change the different modes. Then find out how to change your light metering and change to multi-metering mode and then take a few shots. Then change to center weighted mode and take a few shots. Then to spot mode and take a few shots. Try to see how each light metering mode will give you a different recommended perfect exposure. And then some cameras will have specific dials for this, but others may not. But I want you to find out how to change your exposure compensation values up and down. Now, on some cameras, you may have to customize this to a specific dial yourself, so keep that in mind. Then I want you to find where the histogram is on your camera, and I want you to turn it on, both on the monitor at the back of your camera and in the viewfinder when you are looking through it. Have it on all the time so you get used to seeing it. Then preview a scene with the viewfinder on and slowly move your composition around while watching the histogram change. You can see sections of shadows and highlights move around as your scene moves around as well. Then after that, change your image quality settings to RAW. You can also change to RAW plus JPEG if you have that option and don't mind it taking up all of that SD card space if that's something you want to do as well. And then finally, find out where your white balance settings are and have a play around changing them all with the same scene and composition and see the effects that different presets have or different Kelvin settings have, and then set it to auto for the rest of the course. All right, that's it. I will see you tomorrow.